It's late. The kids are in bed, the streets are quiet, and we're just getting started.
Welcome back to Delayed After Dark, where true crime meets moonlight and mystery. I'm Ducky.
And I'm Orion. And tonight, we're diving into one of the most infamous names in American crime history. A man who ruled Chicago like a king and died like a ghost.
That's right, we're talking about Al Capone, Scarface himself.
Before he was Scarface, before he was the king of the Chicago underworld, Al Capone was just a poor kid from Brooklyn.
Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in the tough neighborhood of Navy Yard in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Gabriel and Teresa Capone, were recent immigrants from Naples, Italy. Gabriel was a barber. Teresa was a seamstress. They weren't criminals. They weren't hustlers. They were just trying to make it in a new country.
They had 9 children. 9. Al was the 4th. The Capones lived in a modest apartment, and life wasn't easy. This was the turn of the 20th century. The streets were crowded, dirty, and ruled by ethnic tensions. Italians, Irish, Jews, and others packed into the same neighborhoods, fighting for work, food, and respect.
Al was a smart kid, believe it or not. He did well in school at first, but he had a short fuse. When he was around 14 years old, he got into a fight with a teacher. Some accounts say she hit him, and he hit back. Either way, he was expelled, and that was the end of his formal education.
That moment, getting kicked out of school, was a turning point. Without structure or direction, Al drifted towards the streets, towards the gangs, and in early 20th century Brooklyn, there were plenty to choose from.
Capone started hanging out with local street crews, like the South Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors. These weren't just playground gangs. These were tough, violent young men who stole, fought, and shook down businesses.
But then came the 5 Points Gang. They were the real deal. Based in Manhattan's Lower East Side, the 5 Points Gang was a powerful Italian-American mob outfit. It was run by Paul Kelly, an elegant, educated gangster who dressed like a Wall Street banker and quoted Shakespeare when he wasn't ordering hits.
The 5 Point Gang was a criminal finishing school. Alumni included Lucky Luciano, Johnny Torrio, and even Bugsy Siegel. Capone started running small jobs for them, protection rackets, beatings, and small-time extortion. He learned how power worked, how loyalty worked, how violence got you respect.
During this time, Capone got a job as a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn, a bar owned by gangster Frankie Yale. It was a rough place, lots of drinking, lots of fighting, and it's where Capone got the infamous scars on his face.
One night, Capone made a crude remark to a woman at the bar. Her brother, Frank Galucio, took offense, pulled a knife, and slashed Al across his left cheek 3 times. The wounds would never heal properly, and from that day on, everyone called him Scarface.
Capone hated that name. Hated it. He always tried to turn his head in photographs, always lied about where the scars came from, said they were from war or from a car accident, but the name stuck.
By 1918, Capone had met a woman named May Coughlin, an Irish immigrant girl from Brooklyn. She was quiet, religious, and grounded. That same year, they had a son, Albert Francis Capone, nicknamed Sonny. Al was just 19 years old.
Interestingly, Capone tried to go straight, briefly. He took jobs as a paper cutter, a bookbinder, even worked at a munitions plant during World War I. But the pull of the underworld was too strong, and soon he got a call that would change everything.
His old 5-point mentor, Johnny Torrio, had moved to Chicago and needed help running a bootlegging operation. Capone packed up his young family and headed west. Chicago wasn't just a new city. It was a new beginning, a blank slate, and it would become the setting for his rise of power and his ultimate downfall.
So that's where we leave the boy from Brooklyn. Scarred, married, ambitious. on a train to Chicago with a wife, a baby, and a suitcase full of criminal potential.
Coming up next, how Capone went from a bartender to a bootlegger boss in the city on fire with corruption. Stick with us on Delays. I don't like that. I'm going to cut that out. Anyway. Al Capone stepped off the train in Chicago in 1919. He wasn't yet a crime lord. He was 20 years old. He had a wife, a baby, and a favor to cash in from his mentor, Johnny Torrio.
Now, Torrio was no street thug. He was strategic and calculated. If the 5 Points gang was the schoolyard, Johnny Torrio's Chicago was graduate-level crime. He ran operations for a man named Big Jim Colosimo, who controlled much of the city's brothels and gambling dens.
But in 1919, everything changed. That year, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, and in 1920, Prohibition officially began. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol became illegal on paper.
But in practice, it just created a gold mine for organized crime. America was thirsty, and people like Torrio and Capone were ready to pour the drinks for a price.
Capone started low-key, acting as Torrio's bodyguard, driver, and muscle, but he quickly impressed. He was good at smoothing over disputes with charm, and even better at settling them with fist, or bullets, when the charm didn't work.
Then came the first major power shift. In 1920, Big Jim Colosimo refused to get into bootlegging. He thought it was too risky. So Torrio allegedly ordered a hit on him. Colosimo was gunned down in his own restaurant. No one was ever convicted, but many believe Capone was the triggerman.
With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio took over, and Capone rose right along with him. By the mid-1920s, Chicago wasn't just a city. It was a battleground. Rival gangs fought over control of territory, speakeasies, breweries, and distribution routes.
And these weren't turf wars with switchblades. These were full-on urban wars with machine guns and car bombs. It was bloody, it was chaotic, and at the center of it all was Al Capone.
In 1925, Torrio was ambushed outside his home by rival gangsters. He survived barely. But the close call rattled him. He packed up his bags, moved back to Brooklyn, and handed the keys to the empire to Capone.
And just like that, Al Capone, at only 26 years old, mind you, became the most powerful crime boss in Chicago.
Alright, now let's paint the picture. Capone controlled over 10,000 speakeasies. He had breweries producing illegal alcohol day in and day out. He ran gambling houses, brothels, and rackets that made sure local businesses paid for protection.
His profits? Staggering. It's estimated that by 1927, his operation was pulling in over $100 million a year. In Depression-era dollars. That's the equivalent of over $1.7 billion today.
And Capone was flashy. He wore tailored suits, expensive fedoras, diamond pinky rings. He drove armored Cadillacs and kept a crew of personal bodyguards. He lived in luxury hotels, the Metropole, then later the Lexington, and booked entire floors for just his entourage.
But here's the twist. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. Capone loved the attention. He gave interviews, he donated to charities, he hosted lavish parties. He positioned himself as a kind of gangster philanthropist, a man who kept the booze flowing, fed the poor, and tipped the waiters like royalty.
The press loved him. The public, even more so. To many, he was a Robin Hood with a Tommy gun, a bootlegger with a conscience, a devil you could trust.
But that image came with a body count. Capone's rule was built on violence. Assassinations, drive-bys, bombings. Anyone who crossed him or even looked like competition was taken out brutally.
By the late 1920s, the city was spiraling. Rival gangs were at war, particularly the North Side Gang, led by a man named George Bugs Moran. And Capone, he was growing more paranoid and more ruthless.
That paranoia would come to a head in the bloodiest day of Capone's criminal career, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Chicago Winter, 1929. The streets are frozen, the air is tense, and the city is on the edge of a knife. Rival gangs are circling each other like sharks in bloodied water.
By now, Al Capone had consolidated massive power. But one name keeps getting in the way. George Bugs Moran, the boss of the North Side gang. If Capone is king of the South Side, Moran is the last obstacle standing between him and total control of Chicago's bootlegging empire.
Capone and Moran hated each other. Moran had tried to kill Capone multiple times, and Capone returned the favor more than once, but nothing worked. Moran was Moran was slippery, violent, and just as ambitious.
So, in February 1929, Capone, or at least someone in his crew, devised a plan to eliminate Moran once and for all. What followed would become one of the most infamous events in American crime history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
It happened on the morning of February 14th in 1929. 7 men, who were members and associates of Moran's crew, were lured to a garage at 2122 North Clark Street on Chicago's north side. They thought that they were meeting to buy a hijacked shipment of bootleg whiskey.
But at around 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac pulled up, 4 men stepped out, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers, 2 in civilian clothes. The cops, in quotation marks, burst into the garage. The 7 Northside men were lined up against the wall.
Then came the gunfire. Over 70 rounds were fired, most of which were from Thompson submachine guns, the infamous Tommy guns of the era. It was fast, ruthless, and shockingly efficient.
5 of the men died instantly, 2 more shortly after. The wall behind them was shredded with bullet holes. Blood pooled on the frozen concrete floor. The officers, in quotation marks, vanished, and so did the getaway car.
Among the dead was Frank Gusenberg, one of Moran's top enforcers. He was the only one found still alive at the scene, but barely. When real police asked who shot him, he famously muttered, "Nobody shot me." Then he died.
The message was clear. The South Side wasn't playing around. Capone, or someone acting in his name, was done waiting. But there was just one problem.
Bugs Moran wasn't there.
He was supposed to be, however. But by pure chance, he arrived late and saw the fake cops entering the building. He backed off, ducked out to avoid massacre by minutes.
When he saw the carnage later, Moran reportedly said, quote, "Only Capone kills like that," end quote.
But despite the suspicion, no one could prove Capone was behind it. He had an airtight alibi. He was in Miami at the time, lounging by the pool, meeting with police. Classic.
Still, the massacre shocked the nation. It was the most brutal gangland slaying America had ever seen. Photos of the bodies ran in newspapers across the country. That's wild. The public turned, the government took notice, and suddenly, Capone's swagger didn't seem so charming anymore.
Politicians called for action. The Chicago PD cracked down hard. The feds started asking serious questions, and the press, once enamored with quotation marks Scarface, now portrayed him as a blood-soaked tyrant.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre didn't destroy Capone's empire, at least not immediately. But it was the moment that the tide turned. The spotlight was on, the heat was rising, and Uncle Sam was about to come knocking.
Al Capone was untouchable, or so it seemed. He ruled Chicago with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. Politicians were in his pockets. Cops looked the other way. He was the king of an empire built on blood and bootleg whiskey.
But in the shadows, a new kind of threat was forming. Not a rival gang, not a street hit, but something more dangerous to a man like Capone, the federal government.
And leading the charge, a quiet, relentless agent with a sharp jawline and a federal badge, Eliot Ness.
Now let's be real. The story of Ness is part fact, part legend. He was just one part of a much larger machine, but he became the face of the Treasury Department's Prohibition Bureau in Chicago. His job was to dismantle Capone's criminal operations, one bootleg at a time.
Ness handpicked a small, incorruptible squad of agents, men who couldn't be bribed, threatened, or turned. The press called them the Untouchables. And they started smashing up Capone's breweries, speakeasies, supply lines, crippling his income slowly.
But here's the kicker. Elliot Ness didn't bring Capone down in the courtroom. That honor went to a much less glamorous figure. Frank J. Wilson, who was an agent with the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS.
That's right, those sons of bitches at the IRS. You see, Capone was smart, but not careful. For years, he flaunted his wealth. Expensive cars, diamond watches, $5,000 shoots, luxury hotel rooms, lavish parties. But on paper, he didn't have a single legitimate job. No salary, no taxes.
And that's where Wilson came in. He quietly built a case, proving Capone had a massive income he never reported. It took years of combing through records, bribed accountants, and scared witnesses, but eventually they got what they needed.
Capone was indicted in 1931 on 22 counts of tax evasion and 5,000 violation of the Volstead Act. That's the law enforcing prohibition. But the government focused on the tax charges. They knew it was their best shot.
The trial started in October of 1931. Capone thought he could buy the jury because he'd done it before. But the judge got wise and switched the jury out at the last minute. Clean slate, no time for bribes, no room for error.
Capone's lawyers tried everything. They argued he didn't personally manage the books, that he was just a businessman, but the evidence was overwhelming, and after a 10-day trial, the verdict came in.
Guilty!
Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and charged nearly $215,000 in back taxes and interest. It was the harshest penalty ever handed down for tax evasion at the time.
Not that he couldn't handle it, as we could all see. He was first sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary, but even behind bars, this man tried to live like a king, bribing guards, getting extra privileges. So, in 1934, the government made a super bold move.
And bold indeed. They transferred his ass to Alcatraz, the Rock, a cold, isolated prison in San Francisco Bay. No bribery, no special treatment, just concrete steel and time.
Capone was prisoner number 85-AZ, and for the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. No guns, no gang, no empire, just a cell, a cot, and the weight of everything he'd built crashing down around him. But that's not exactly 100% true because he was still living pretty cushy there as well.
Yes, he was, but no matter how cushy he was living, there was something else eating him alive. Something far worse than the United States government.
It was syphilis.
Contracted syphilis. Yeah, Capone had contracted syphilis back in his younger years, probably during his early days working at brothels in Brooklyn. He never got it treated, and by the time he was in Alcatraz, the disease had reached his brain.
That sucks, because the man started deteriorating mentally and physically. He'd lose his train of thought, repeat conversations, and stare into space. Eventually, he believed he was playing music in a phantom orchestra, and he even talked to ghosts.
And in 1939, after serving 7 years of his sentence, he was released for good behavior. And because he was mentally unfit. He was 40 years old, but a shell of his former self.
He spent the last years of his life in seclusion at his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. See, told you he still wasn't having any problems with money. Isolated, confused, and forgotten, the most feared man in America was reduced to a trembling whisper.
And he died on January 25th, 1947, from cardiac arrest after a stroke. He was 48 years old.
Capone once ruled a city. He lived like a king, feared like a god, but in the end, it wasn't a bullet or a rival that brought him down. It was paperwork, a disease, and time.
And, that's the story. From the gutters of Brooklyn to the throne of Chicago and back to dust.
So here we are, listeners. Al Capone is dead, buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery next to his family in a quiet plot that says only, "My Jesus Mercy."
But Capone didn't really die, did he? Not in a cultural sense. The man is long gone. But the legend, that only got bigger, glorified, mythologized, and distorted.
He's been turned into everything from a gangster anti-hero to a tragic cautionary tale. Books, films, documentaries, Halloween costumes, video games, even cigars. There's a version of Al Capone for everybody.
But the real Capone was ruthless, manipulative, and extremely violent. He built the empire on corruption, fear, and blood. Was ruthless, manipulative, and extremely violent. But he built an empire on corruption, fear, and blood. But after he died, he became sort of a folk hero, especially during the Depression era.
Yeah, people were hurting. Banks were collapsing, families were starving, and here comes Capone. He's this rich, powerful dude. He's sticking it to the government. He even ran a soup kitchen in Chicago, serving over 2,000 meals a day during the height of the Depression.
Yeah, and some say that was just PR. It moved to soften his image while the feds were circling. But it worked. To many, he wasn't a monster. He was a Robin Hood with a Tommy gun.
Hollywood picked up on that fast. Starting in the 1930s, Capone became the blueprint for the gangster archetype. Characters based on him showed up in dozens of films. Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, Scarface. Yeah, the original 1932 version was basically Capone with a mustache.
And then came De Niro, unforgettable portrayal of the Untouchables in 1987. The baseball bat scene? Iconic, brutal, completely fictional. But man, did it sell.
He was even played by Tom Hardy in 2020's Capone, showing the decaying version of the man who was paranoid, broken, and haunted by ghosts and memory loss. It was one of the few portrayals that actually focused on his downfall rather than his rise.
But all of these versions, from glamorous to grotesque, have one thing in common. They focus on who Capone appeared to be, not always what he really was.
He wasn't just a guy in a pinstripe suit chomping on a cigar. He ran illegal alcohol, yes, but also prostitution rings, extortion rackets, and murder for hire operations. The real cost of his empire was human life.
And yet, America loves a rebel, especially one who takes on the system. Capone became the symbol of the American outlaw, flawed, flashy, untouchable. But he wasn't untouchable. He was just unprosecutable until he slipped.
Today you'll find his name everywhere. Al Capone-themed bars, tours in Chicago tracing his footsteps. There's even a line of Capone-branded whiskey. It's capitalism rebranding crime.
But there's also another side of his legacy, one that impacted law enforcement forever. The federal government realized it needed new tools to fight organized crime. Better forensics, accounting, wiretapping laws, witness protection. Capone's new empire forced the evolution of the federal crime fighting.
And he paved the way for later gangsters like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and even John Gotti. They saw what Capone did right, and more importantly, what he did wrong.
So, what's the lesson here? That crime doesn't pay? Maybe, or maybe it does. For a while.
Maybe the real lesson is this. Power without boundaries always collapses. Capone got everything he ever wanted, and yet that still wasn't enough. He was bigger than the law until the law adapted.
He died forgotten, riddled with disease, barely able to recognize his own name. Not exactly the ending you see in the movies.
But maybe that's the ending we should remember. The man behind the myth, the cost of the crown. Tell me, Ducky, where are your thoughts at with Capone? What do you think about his life and how he handled things, and especially his treatment at Alcatraz? We talked a little bit about that in our previous episode about how Alcatraz was silent, and it can seriously cause problems for some of the people who were imprisoned there.
Yeah, so I just wanna start with debatably, during this entire thing, who's the real criminals here? Because the IRS is the ones that took him down, right? So I'm not saying that, he was right for not paying taxes, but if I was in his position, I don't know if I would, right? But all jokes aside, he's actually someone who I really kind of think is not a great time in history, but kind of like a cool little time in history, like especially during like the bootlegging prohibition era, right? He kind of is, like we've discussed, the symbol for that. And the fact that he was able to build a empire from really nothing and get become so influential, and even with all of his influence, whether or not he was doing it for the right reasons, he still tried to give back to Chicago, right? Like with the soup kitchens in a time where people needed some sort of hope. He was kind of that hope that they were getting, right? Whether or not they had to pay for protection or whatever, like he kind of became a hope symbol. Like he was able to do well and he was still giving back to the community. As with how we turned Chicago to like the biggest crime network ever, and still to this day is fucking horrible with crime. Not the best thing that you want to see, especially with the gangster era. But I think one thing that really interests me about this case is, despite the stuff that he was charged for, right? There's really no way you can connect him to any of the other crimes. Like the Valentine's Day Massacre, that is one of the biggest debated things ever, right? Like they're like, hey, there's this person, or they go, this event happened. It looks like he did it, but we can't pin it on him at all, right? And the fact that the person he was trying to get showed up like 20 minutes or like 5 minutes late kind of makes you think. Well, what are your thoughts on it?
Um, I'm kind of on the fence. I don't really know. Like it's like you were saying how he was able to build this empire from practically nothing. Like it practically got handed to him, dropped in his lap, and was like, "Here you go, bro. I'm going back to New York." That being said, he took the opportunity to get himself involved in a lot of things that, not necessarily good things, because there was a lot of bloodshed and there was a lot of fear mongering during the time frame where Capone and his guys were like running Chicago. But at the same time, you have to think about, okay, maybe the dude, caused some issues. Maybe there was some violence. But at the same time, it's almost like he was trying to validate or maybe vindicate himself for the crimes that he was committing by returning as much as he could, or as much as would be socially acceptable anyway, to the streets. So he had soup kitchens. He was, making sure people had money. He was making sure people had food. He was donating to charities. He was hosting beautiful, lavish parties where he would convince other people with money to donate to charities and help out the homeless and whatnot. It's kind of hard to put yourself on one side or the other with Al Capone. And, even though he was eventually caught for tax evasion and had to pay out a total of like $300,000 between his back taxes and his fines that were levied against him, and he had to spend some time in prison. The dude still had what was essentially $1.7 billion a year in today's money. He was rich and he was famous. And a lot of the things that they don't mention are things like, yes, the man did end up in Alcatraz, but what's not mentioned regularly in stories about him, whether it's books, movies, etc., he lived quite comfortably in Alcatraz. Last I knew, his cell was still decorated the same way that it was while he was an inmate there. He had gorgeous furniture, he had a desk, he had a gorgeous bed, he had beautiful blankets, he had a recliner chair. Like, he had the works in there. And that should show you, looking back on our previous episode regarding Alcatraz, just how bad Alcatraz was as a place to be imprisoned. Because even with all of his creature comforts, he still managed to come out a shell of who he formerly was. based on the fact that they didn't catch that the man was dying of syphilis.
Yeah. So kind of, I think we discussed it. He knew he had syphilis. He just never got treated for it, right? Which kind of, I guess it might be a thing like where you don't have a doctor you trust. I'm assuming when you live that sort of lifestyle where you're constantly committing crime, constantly double crossing people, you kind of have to just, I guess, I don't know. Like I guess you would just have to kind of always watch your back. I understand. I know what I'm trying to say, but I don't know how I'm trying to say it. Like when you live a life like that, you're gonna have a lot of enemies, right? Like he was
Right.
constantly at war with the North. So I'm assuming that you wouldn't go to the doctor a lot because, they could be siding with the other gang. The other gang could have paid him off,
You
especially in this
wouldn't
time of
trust
the Great
anyone at
Depression.
that point.
Yeah, especially at this time of the Great Depression, it's really just whoever pays them more, you know? So I don't know. Especially that Capone was really good at covering his tracks, I guess, from what I'm seeing. I don't know. He just became kind of I guess, the status symbol of the 1920s, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It does make sense. And I think a big part of what's kind of dragging me down here as we finish up recording the end of this episode, looking at it, and you're like, I mean, I know it sounds kind of cliche, but he was basically Robin Hood with a Tommy gun. He was
Yeah.
making sure that the poor people were taken care of. He was making sure that his area was well protected, doing the best that he could to be ensured that all of the people had their basic needs met. And at the same time, I understand that he was committing crimes, but we don't have any solid proof that he's connected to any of those crimes other than the fact that somebody said, oh, he might have been there. The only proof of any crime that he had committed was in the fact that there was paperwork, a paper trail, proving that he had evaded taxes for a couple of years. And I don't know, it's under my skin a little bit because, put it simply, growing up poor, I wish we had an anti-hero like him.
Yeah, he definitely, at the time, was kind of like the man, I guess is the way to put it. Like he
Yeah.
was the guy that Chicago turned to, and like we've discussed, the public loved him because I mean, when you look at everything he actually did for Chicago, despite all the bad shit, he he's the reason that Chicago's probably still as big as it is today. You know?
Yeah. It's difficult. That being said, before I end up even more teary-eyed, I think we should pull into closing here. When it comes to Capone, what do we really take away? He was a man of contradictions. He was both charitable and cruel, strategic and self-destructive, and a symbol of American hustle and American hubris.
He didn't just run a criminal empire. He built one. And when it came crashing down, it didn't happen with bullets or betrayal. It happened with balance sheets, courtrooms, and untreated disease.
In the end, Al Capone is less a legend and more a lesson about power, about consequences, about the lies we choose to believe, and especially the ones that look good in a suit and a fedora. That's all the time we have for this episode. If you want to chat with us about it, please hit us up in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, and for all of your questions, comments, concerns, bitches, moans, or gripes, you can chat with us in the comments or send us an email directly. The email address is in the description of every episode.
Absolutely. We read every communication and we respond as soon as we have the opportunity. We love to hear from you guys, so please do. With that, I'm Orion.
And I'm Ducky.
And this has been
Delayed After Dark. See you next time.